Again, thanks for coming, and a reminder that the textbook that we'll be mainly following is Arnold and Byers Encountering the Old Testament. I've done some video or some PowerPoint presentation supplementing that. So you'll recognize the color scheme when it's theirs, and I've modified it and then a different color scheme than it's mine. And in the schedule that I handed out last week, those who knew this week, it's not going to be the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be changed. It's going to be, we're going to go through the 4 lessons today, but I'm going to change the order slightly. And then later on there might be some changes coming up, and I'll let you know ahead of time. Because I thought today we'll dive in right into Scripture itself, and then look at some of the background information later on in the class. But we can start with Genesis 1. I'm just introducing a little bit, thinking about the usage of words, how we use words, how we understand words, and seeing how words are used in Scripture, really in everything that we read. We can see there are known words and unknown words. That is, if you're a teacher, well, and we all were of our children or somebody, you start where the student is, using things that are mutually understood by both parties. And as you're teaching new things, you introduce new words. Beth, this morning as we were saying goodbye to her after the service, she said somebody talked to her last week after class or sometime during the week and said, learned a new word, one about Herman and somebody. So she said, hermeneutics? Yeah, that's right. Well, there are known and unknown words. And it's interesting when you're reading through Scripture to see what is known and what is unknown, what requires explanation, what is known by the author and the audience that they share together, but also what they need to be told about. And what is known and what is unknown shows the world of the writer and the reader. There's a common understanding. You don't need to explain certain things that we share together, but if we're teaching something new, then we have to explain who this Herman is and what we mean by hermeneutics. Now for us, for example, if I was saying, the president says, we think, when I'm making this video right now, we think Barack Obama. For those of you who are on video, that would show that this might have been made some time ago, because in another year that will be a different name. But a large group of folks, even here in this country, when they say the president, they would think of Enrique Peña Nieto, who's the Mexican president. Our context, when I say president, we understand it in a certain way, while other people in the world using the same word would understand it differently. And so part of our reading is to say, okay, are we on the same page when they use a word as when we use a word? Are they referring to the same thing we are? Or might we need to do a little digging, a little thinking about the terms that are being used? Now let's go to the first verse of the Bible. I've got here now with me the NIV, just because it's one of my smaller ones to carry around. Some of you would have a slightly different translation to this. But in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now in this, is God known or unknown? There's no explanation given. When he says God, he expects the people to understand who he's talking about. There's no explanation of God. Does he exist? There's no argumentation whether God exists or not. There's no explanation of what his nature is. An interesting theological exercise, by the way, to understand people's view and to understand who God is, which is really what the study of theology is. I think it might be an exercise for you to do this evening or sometime when you go home, is take Genesis 1, read through it, have a pad, and say, suppose I'd never seen this before at all. I didn't know who the Israelite God is. What do I learn about God just by reading Genesis chapter 1? It's really what theology is. Theology is the study of God. And so what can I learn just from reading this chapter? Well, you can see things even from this verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So God, if you've never seen it before, first of all, we see that God is a given. He's part of the shared worldview, but God is a creator. God seems to be prior to whatever beginning this is. That is, this must not be talking about absolute beginnings of everything that ever existed, because God, at least, is there. Francis Schaeffer's written a book called The God Who Is There. And that's really what we see here. God, who's being spoken about, is known to the reader, to the writer. In the exercise that I suggested that you look at, it might not be known to you because if this was the first time you saw this passage, but you can still learn a lot about this being God from what we have here in the text. Let's unpack the word God a little bit. What word is used here? Now in Hebrew, the word, Hebrew on the left, in the middle for one or two of you who haven't had Hebrew, is Elohim. That's the transliteration of what it sounds like in English. And it's translated into English as God or gods. Again, we usually translate it because it's talking about the Israelite God, the Judeo-Christian God. Customarily capitalize that. But we'll see it's also used for other forms that, for various reasons, we don't capitalize. Because this word is not a proper name. It's equivalent to the word, well, as I say here, the word car. I drive a car. Small c. Now, someone might ask you, what do you drive? I drive a Chevy or a Ford or a Chrysler or whatever. All of a sudden that becomes capitalized. That's named a specific car, but this one is a general term. And it can be used in various different ways. It can be used for the gods of the other nations. It's about the same word, Elohim, the god of the Canaanites, the Philistines, the Egyptians, and there, because of customary practice, well, let me take one step back. In Hebrew, you don't capitalize any words. There's no words that are capitalized. They're all the same in Hebrew. And so part of our cultural chauvinism, because it's our God, we put it in capitals. It's your God. You're a pagan. We only give you small g, God, but it's the same word that's used there. So it could be the gods of the surrounding peoples as well as the God of Israel. But it was also used of the God of Israel. And it's also used the God of an individual. It talks about, later on in Genesis, it talks about the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So you've got to see, meaning again comes from context. Who are you talking to? What do they understand as God? How does that correlate to how you understand God? But here, as I say in Genesis 1, the author and the audience seem to be on the same page. So he doesn't have to explain what's going on. So this is talking about the Israelite God. And when there's no qualifier, no explanation, like the God of Israel or the God of Egypt or the God of the Philistines, you see that it's going to be understood. It's expected by the speaker, the author, that the word will be understood in his audience. One other use of the term, which is we don't have very often in English, but a few times it occurs in Hebrew. It can be used as an adjective. It talks about, in Jonah 3:3, it says Nineveh is a city of God, if you like. We would say a great city, a huge city. It's a superlative kind of adjective. The only time I've been able to figure out us using it, I don't like the use of the term, but when somebody says something like that's god-awful, we don't speak like that down here in the South, but it's very, very bad, using it as kind of an intensifier. And so that can be that way as well in the Hebrew Old Testament. So in the beginning, God, in Hebrew, by the way, that's 2 words. And so we spent 10 minutes on one word. We're going to have trouble getting through everything. But what I'm going to be doing is unpacking in more depth Genesis 1, 2, and 3, just because they're so foundational to the understanding of Scripture. We can't go into that great depth anywhere else, so we're going to be picking up speed later. Another term that's interesting, 2 terms in Hebrew and in English. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I don't know if any of you are English teachers, if so, you know more about some of this stuff than I do, but this is what's called a merism, where you have 2 parts that we use for the whole. We use young and old. Everybody came out to buy pumpkins, young and old. Well, there were middle-aged people there as well. All age groups are represented. We just use 2 of these. In the Bible, they have several of these too. It talks about Israel settled Dan to Beersheba. Dan's in the north, Beersheba's in the south, but they also lived in Jerusalem and Bethlehem and Hebron and everywhere else. But you just don't want to take time to give every town. You just give 2 extremes. This weather's not fit for man or beast. It's not good for women either, or children, or domesticated animals, or whatever. But you just use this, a merism, large and small. What we have here, God created the heavens and the earth. It could be literal. He created the heavens and the earth, but it seems to be more than that, because in Genesis 1, there's more created than just the sky and the ground. We've got plants, we've got people, we've got... In Greek, they have a term that is all-encompassing, the word cosmos, which we would understand as the universe. There is no single word in Hebrew. It's not that they didn't have a concept of it, they just didn't have an all-encompassing word like cosmos. So that seems to be what's going on here. In the beginning, God created everything, not just these 2 things, heavens and the earth, but saying God created everything that exists. Some of you, this might trigger something in your memory where it talks about God creating everything that exists. There's a fellow named John who wrote a gospel. In the very beginning, it says in John 1:3, all things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. The whole first chapter of John is looking back here at the first chapter of Genesis, picking up, looking at some of the same ideas, expounding them a little bit. So this is really saying the same kind of thing. All things came into being through him. A little bit more about heavens and earth. These are known words. There's no explanation of them. He's using familiar terms here. The audience knew them. The writer knew them. They shared an understanding. So as I say, this is not Never Never Land or the Land of Oz or some other place that's completely different from what we know. God created the heavens, if you like, the sky. We can look out and see it now, even though it's thousands of years after that event. And the earth, what we're standing on, this same place. Again, it's things that we know, things we're familiar with. So all of that from chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What's the function of this first verse? It's probably a summary statement, giving you like a chapter heading. I don't know if you've ever read Victorian novels or even Pilgrim's Progress from earlier, where at the beginning of each chapter of Pilgrim's Progress, it says chapter 1, in which Pilgrim, they give you, in that case, they might give you a 10-sentence introduction to what the chapter's going to be all about. So if you're studying for your high school test on Pilgrim's Progress, if you were me, you'd just read the summaries at the beginning, you wouldn't worry about the chapters themselves. That could be what we've got here in verse 1, is just a summary. So the story is going to continue on. It could have stopped here, but they wanted to explain, to elaborate, to go into more detail on what's going on in this creation. And so that's what we do in the rest of chapter 1. And going on, spilling over into chapter 2. Theologically, as we said, it's stating that God created everything, nothing exists. I jumped the gun, I read John, and there we've got the verse in John given for you. A couple of comments on the first 2 words in Hebrew. Hebrew behaves a bit differently than English, in that it reads from right to left. So we're all cheating. We're starting at the end of the book and finding out what's going on here when you're supposed to start at the beginning. But I'm just going to pick out these 2 words to show you the literary craftsmanship that we have in Genesis and in the whole Bible. It's not something that comes through as much in English. I mean, we'll talk more about that if you're around next semester. Yeah, that much stamina to be here in January or whenever we start the next one. We're talking about poetry, and there they have literary craft. But the first 2 words of Genesis, Bereshit bara. Here's the transliteration of it, Bereshit bara. And even here you can see the first 2 words. The first 3 letters are exactly the same. Forget the dots. The actual consonants are B and B, R and R, and then this aleph, like an A sound. They're exactly the same. They have nothing to do with each other in meaning. If you look through Genesis 1, you can see that it says God created, He made, He formed. There are half a dozen different words that the author did or could have used and did use. But I think it might be purposeful that he's showing, in Genesis 1, he's showing how God is a God of order. And everything's in its place. And one way of showing that could be for your eyes to see you've got a correspondence here between these first 2 words. In the beginning, and then He created. But we won't talk about that kind of thing much, as I said, because our Hebrew needs some work. Maybe next year, who knows, we can have one of these for people. Genesis 2. He's narrowing the focus now. God created everything that exists, and it's all important. It's all under God's control. And I'm going to narrow the interest down now. As for the earth, we're going to be looking at this narrowing down in a later lesson. That's verse 2. Now the earth was formless and empty. Just a little bit of discussion of those 2 words. It doesn't like my Hebrew transliteration here. It gives something in, I don't know if it's Gaelic or something like that. It's tohu and vohu in Hebrew. Again, it's rhyming. These 2 words happen to be sound the same. So again, some literary artistry that's coming through. Now, what does it mean? Meaning comes from context. The earth was tohu and vohu. I have no clue what that means. It was made out of green cheese. That would fit the context. The earth was 3,000 degrees centigrade. Physically, it wouldn't work, but it could fit the context. What does it mean? See somebody looking here up Isaiah 45:18, or here's some pages moving. Somebody's got Isaiah 45:18. They read that for us.
For thus says the Lord, who created the heavens. He is God, who formed the earth and made it. He established it. He did not create it a chaos. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is no other.
Okay. He did not make it chaos, is that word, tohu and vohu. Is that saying the opposite of what we said here? In Genesis 1:2, it says the earth was tohu and vohu. There he says he didn't create it, tohu and vohu. I think what it's saying there in Isaiah 45:18 is talking about ultimate goals. I created it. What was the not? Immediately after that, I said, I didn't create a chaos.
He formed it to be inhabited.
He formed it to be inhabited. So we could read this as saying, the earth was uninhabited and uninhabitable. In the state it was, it didn't sustain life. But God's purpose was for there to be life. And so as we're going to see, the rest of the chapter, the rest of the book, if you like, is life is coming into being. And then also, we see here, darkness was over the surface of the deep. It's not evil. It's just stating that it's there. We're going to see in a few verses later that God names it, so he has some control over it. And it talks about the deep, the uninhabitable oceans. They're also not evil. And you'll see why I mention this evil connotation in a couple of lessons from now when we look at the ancient Near Eastern background of creation. So what it has is kind of a picture at the beginning. It's lifeless, it's formless, it's disorganized, and that's the first stage, if you like. And now God is going to be forming and organizing and giving shape. And from these verses, we've got three, if you like, obstacles to life. One is darkness. One is water everywhere. Well, the third one's not really an obstacle, it's just an observation that it's uninhabitable and uninhabited. And that's going to be looked after in this chapter. So these are the three pre-creation elements, if you like. In some ways you could see it as the artist has his canvas, the paints are around, the artist has an envisaged end for all of this, but looking at his studio now, it's kind of chaotic. But now there's going to be order coming. My wife would tell you in my office, all the time it's chaotic. She's waiting for the order to come. But hopefully there will be some. Yes?
Same here.
Question.
Over here. Why do we not hear about the universe? You know, the first verse is the universe. And then it was up there that we don't think about it or worry about the universe. We never hear any studies about the universe.
Well, see, the area of interest of the biblical text is what happens on earth, specifically what happens to humanity, and specifically what happens to part of humanity. As I said, we'll see more of this narrowing down. God is not saying that astrophysics is of the devil and you shouldn't be worried about it. He's just saying, my story that I'm telling here is interested in humanity, my relationship with them, their relationship with each other. And that's where the problems come in. And so he could have revealed another tome somewhere about other aspects of the physical universe, but he didn't choose to do that. So, in this chapter then, God is looking after each one of these elements. Now this is one place again where your eyes will come in. I said this is one of the most important tools for biblical studies. So as I say, what does the text say? So for the day one, which is verses 3 through 5, the means of creation, God says, and it comes into being. So I always ask, we don't have time to ask it here as a rhetorical or a non-rhetorical question, but we ask, how does God create? And people answer, by his word. But then I ask, is that the only way he creates? So that's how he creates. We'll keep our eyes open. Here in this verse, God creates by speaking. But I want us to be careful as we read. And the first creation, I'd say, is really an aspect of separation. He creates light. Darkness had already been there, so now there's, if you like, separation of darkness from light. So he's ordering it, he's regulating. And it says also in verse 4 that he appreciates it. Saw that the light was good. And if you ask, what does good mean here? It doesn't seem to have any moral good boy, bad boy kind of thing. it seems to be, as I said, this is what he wanted. It's as it was intended. My masterpiece is well started. It also, I think, says something which I think is powerful for us to think about. God is also a God of aesthetics. You could say this is a beauty term. This is good, this is nice, it's something that I can appreciate. Something we appreciate about worshiping with you. You have a nice physical facility. One of the things we like when we travel to England is go to the big cathedrals that are there, or other places too. You can worship God just as easily outside or in a mud hut, but it seems to lift your heart up when the surroundings are beautiful. And God, I think that's part of his creation. And he names, as I said, the light day and the darkness he called night. As the one who created these, he's able to manage them. He gives names, well, even in our society, we give names to things that we have some control over. My wife and I named our children. I'm sure our neighbors also had words for our children, but they might not have told us what they were, but we provided official names, if you like. So God is giving the official name to his creation. And also just to note here, as we come to this verse, God called the light day. This is a 24-hour period. That particular term just means the time of light as against the time of darkness. There's a big debate. Is he talking about 24-hour days or ages or something? We'll talk about that in a later presentation. But the first time the word is used, it's not a 24-hour period. It's the daylight period. It could be 12 hours. If that's where you are. It could be shorter than that. So the obstacle to life that's being looked after here, if you like, was the first one in our list, was the darkness. He's preparing for the coming of life. In the second day, what is created? Well, I say, you could say water, but it's a vault in the NIV, or a space, a firmament in King James, an expanse to separate different parts of the water. It's to separate terrestrial water, the groundwater, and the water in the atmosphere. And it doesn't specifically say how it was created. It says, let there be, but it is by speaking, it seems to be. But it's also a separation, the water above from the water below. And the second aspect of creation that's being addressed here is the water. In day 3, what's created? The dry land, if you like. The land seems to have been under the water. It doesn't say where it comes from. But we're separating the water into pools or oceans, whatever, and we're forming and arranging the earth. So this is, again, more separation. Water's being separated out, and the earth is there, the dry land. And so the third obstacle for life was the unformed earth, and now it's being formed. But all of a sudden here, the literary pattern that we got used to, if we had time to read these through in detail, it breaks down, because we have a second creation event happening on this particular day. It says, instead of saying there was evening, there was morning, day 3, it goes back in again, and God does some more creating. He creates the first living things. The plants are mentioned now. And it says, verse 12, the land produced vegetation at the command of God, but God wasn't, according to this picture, he wasn't speaking it into being. He's using a secondary means of creation. The land is bringing forth the plant material that's there. So to kind of summarize this, we have the darkness, and then God approaches this and separates light from darkness. Then we have the watery abyss and sky, and the water below was formed. And then we have the formless earth. So the earth and sea and the plants are formed. So the first part in Genesis 1:2 was it was formless. Now we've got form. The next days, I'm going through it more quickly again, but it talks about the greater light and the lesser light. So we would call them the sun, the moon, and the stars are being made. The reason why they're mentioned in verse 18 is to govern the day and the night, to separate light from darkness. And also, it talks about, where's that verse? There we are in verse 14. To serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. This is to help the farmer, if you like, to know when to plant and when to harvest. Notice the lights aren't mentioned, aren't named here. I mentioned the sun, moon, and stars. It probably doesn't mention them on purpose. The Canaanite word for the sun god is the same as the Hebrew word for sun, shamash. And there's also a moon god called Yerach. And the stars were Mesopotamian deities. Mesopotamia is over there. We have a map, so we've got a rock. If the verse said God created Shamash and Yerach, the Canaanites would have said, that's great, we're polytheists, so we can worship Shamash and Yerach. The Babylonians were polytheists. They worshiped the astral deity, so they could have said, God created our gods, so we can worship them. But what the writer is here is saying that these aren't even worth being given names. He just created a big light, 100-watt bulb, the 60-watt bulb. Oh, and I almost forgot, the stars as well. Babylonians were a huge nation. They were a great threat to them. We'll see later on in their history. But their gods, it was kind of an afterthought that God created. A technical term we could use here called demythologization. You don't use it in polite language, polite conversation, but making these things to show they're not divine, they're just part of God's creation. In day 5, the living creatures, the fish and the birds. It also mentions sea creatures. I think King James talks about sea monsters. They're not necessarily bad things. They're created by God. They're not divine. And so now the water is being populated. In day 6, we have 2 creation events again. We have living creatures, and then we have humanity. The land creatures are distinguished again by their species, so there's separation. And then human beings are created especially different from anything else in creation, because it says, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. So a summary here, days 4 through 6. The darkness is addressed by the sun, moon, and stars. The water and sky are filled by the fish and the birds. And then the unformed earth have animals and human beings there.
I have a question.
Yes.
Verse 26 is always something because it says let us.
Okay. Let us in verse 26. It's a good question. Remember I said the word Elohim, God, is the one that's used in this particular chapter. And it is, in fact, grammatically a plural form, but it's usually understood in Israel's context as singular. We'll see when we get to Deuteronomy 6:4, it says, hear, O Israel, the Lord our Elohim, Yahweh our Elohim, Yahweh is one. So for them it's a unified statement. So some would argue that in fact, us, there is, shows a polytheistic background, but I don't see that in Israel. Some suggest it might be the heavenly council, because we're not sure exactly who is involved in the heavenly council, but we've got God. In Job, at the beginning of Job, it says that Satan came in and was talking in this context. Another thing that it could be is, we call it the royal we. If I heard, I haven't seen official proof of it, but Queen Victoria would say, "We are not amused." Something happened, "We are not amused." Everybody else was laughing, but since the Queen said that. The only place I've heard this is you go to the hospital to have a hernia operation, and you come out of it, and you're great pain and you're wheezing, and the nurse comes in and says, "How are we today?" What do you mean, we? I am in great pain. So it could be the royal or nursely we. God as a creator could be talking about we. From a Christian perspective, we could say that the Trinity is lying behind this. But from an Old Testament perspective, they have no concept of the Trinity. Whoever wrote this would have had no Trinity in mind. But as a Christian, we could say, it is there, kind of latent, kind of hidden. But I think for myself, that's kind of giving it a Christian tint where it wouldn't have had it in the original. So you're going to find when you ask questions, I'll be glad to respond to them, but it's going to be worse when you leave than when you begin. All kinds of possibilities there.
Well, since it's not explained, it must not be an important thing.
Well, it would have been their known, remember this, their known terms, they would have understood what was going on. Our problem is that we don't necessarily know. So what we're having to do is, it's not saying it's not important, but it might have been so important.
That's probably not the way of putting it, it's
Yeah.
just, it's not important at the time,
That's not the focus of what he's trying to
Yeah.
teach there. Yeah.
or part of the lesson.
Yeah. Let me just show here, too, a little bit about the hierarchical relationships that occur in this particular chapter. In the beginning, there was just God. God was there by God itself. And then we have humanity in the image of God. So having a position that's close to God. Psalm 8 talks about what is man that you are mindful, or human beings that you're mindful of them, but you make them just a little bit lower than God. And then we have the animals, and then we have the plants. So these are, if you like, hierarchical relationship of authority. God is the highest authority, but humanity is his co-regent, vice king, if you like. He's given things, human beings, for their superintendence and control. See this a little bit more in chapter 2. And that includes the animals and the plants. But that's how we leave it in Genesis 1. And Tom, we probably better leave it there.